Last week, we were left off with David in exile. And as I've been going through this, I've noticed it's not until much later on that we're going to hear David again uh, calling on the Lord for advice. While he's in exile, he's not. He is exiled by his son, Absolom, and we see that he's on his way back now. Absolom has died, and we recall that Joab thrust him through. Scripture describes Absolom as having been hanged between heaven and earth, presumably by his hair, which was his source of pride. And he was riding a donkey, which kings ride, but they don't ride donkeys in battle. But he was doing that in battle. So it seems almost inevitable that Absolom was going to lose. Of course, we also know that David had placed Hushai, an advisor, to thwart the advice of Ahithophel, who was usually regarded as very wise. But we discovered that Absolom chooses to seek the advice of Hushai as opposed to Ahithophel. And Ahithophel goes, puts his house in order, and hangs himself. Presumably because if David is going to be restored to the kingdom, David is going to see Ahithophel as a traitor. But that's interesting because David, as we're going to find out, is absolutely gracious to everyone. He's gracious to everyone, even those who abused him. And it seems that Ahithophel presumes the vengeance of David. It's kind of foolish. Are we going to presume the vengeance of God because of what we've done? When in reality, God wants to be gracious to us.
On the other hand, there is a punishment of some sort when we misbehave. It's like we're his children, right?
Right.
Your children step out of line and you have to just, and then God does the same thing to us. He's not trying to hurt us. He's trying to point us in the right direction and remind us, I'm in control. Just pay attention to what I'm telling you.
You got it. He's like a father. And if we deserve a spanking, we'll get a spanking. That's what good fathers do. David was not the very best of fathers, which is why we see this terrible rebellion on the part of Absolom, the part of Amnon, who raped his half sister.
Now, did this all come down on him because of his sin with Bathsheba? Because he was told that things were not going to be so cool. I'm not going to kill you or anything like that, but your family is going to be a little bit messed up. And I believe it's from that incident.
Right, it is. And God had promised that to David because of that. And we're going to discover, if I go fast enough through this passage, that the sins of the father impact the children.
Amen.
We're going to see that in, I think it's chapter 22. Okay. We see that David is on his way back to Jerusalem. He's on the other side of the Jordan. The battle had taken place the battle against Absolom had taken place on the other side of the Jordan. And it says that the woods there swallowed up more men than men killing men. It seems as if, obviously, God saw to it that those who led the rebellion against David would lose. God was fighting on behalf of David. So David is on his way back, and he runs into Ziba. Ziba, as we recall, was the servant of Mephibosheth, who was the son of Saul, a cripple. Remember that?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Okay. And Mephibosheth was dining at David's table. David was showing kindness to the family of Jonathan, Saul's son, who David loved. And he was showing this kindness through Mephibosheth. So Ziba, who was the servant of Mephibosheth, verse 1, chapter 16, met him with a couple saddled donkeys and a number of raisin cakes and so on and so forth, some wine. And then he proceeds he's doing a favor to David. And yet he's revealing that he's not exactly the loyal person that he should be. And the king said, where's Mephibosheth? Where's your master's son? Verse 3. And Ziba proceeds to give him a cock and bull story. Behold, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me. Whoa. He's telling him that Mephibosheth is thinking that he's going to get the kingdom back instead of David. So the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. This is David's response. I'm handing everything that belonged to Mephibosheth to you. And that's exactly what Ziba wanted. He wanted to hear that. I'm going to get some good stuff out of this. I prostrate myself. Let me find favor in your sight, O Lord the King. That's Ziba's response. When David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out from there a man of the family of the house of Shaul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out cursing continually as he came. You know what? I'm in chapter 16, and we're reviewing. He cursed David. Here we go. We're in verse 15. Absolom enters Jerusalem. Then Absolom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And we recall that Ahithophel had given advice to Absolom, and Absolom thought it was pretty good advice, but he says, let me hear from Hushai. Hushai had been sent to spy on Absolom. And he takes, by God's grace, it was God's mercy or God's providence that Ahithophel, that Absolom would take Hushai's advice and not Ahithophel's. And the advice was, get all of Israel to come and we'll overwhelm David with superior numbers. And we'll fight and win that way. Well, in order to get all Israel to join, it would take some time. So it gave David some time to collect himself. He was tired from his journey out of Jerusalem. Okay. So we see that David is warned by the prophet, the priests, that he had sent to be with Absolom, Abiathar and Zadok. They get wind of Avshalom's plan on how he's going to defeat David, and David prepares. So they have the battle. David, verse 24, David came to Machanaim, and Avshalom crossed the Jordan, and they have a battle. In preparation for the battle, he says to Joab, verse 15 of chapter 20, deal gently with Absolom. Do I have you confused, or are you following along?
Where are you? You're in Samuel?
I'm in 2 Samuel, chapter 18.
Okay, let me get there. And what verse? 15?
Verse 5.
Okay.
Now, in preparation for the battle, he says to Joab, Avishai, and Ittai, who are leading the battle. And I think I had mentioned earlier that Ittai is leaving with Jerusalem with David. And he says, hey, why don't you go back? You're a Philistine. Why are you staying with me? Did I discuss this? Yes, I think I did. And Ittai's response is like that of Ruth. Where you go, I'm going to go. I'm loyal to you. And so Ittai is one of the leaders of the troops. So we see here that he divides the troops into among three men. Joab and Abishai are his nephews, the sons of his sister, Zeruiah, and Ittai, the foreigner. And he says to them, verse 5, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absolom. Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, which is on the east side of the Jordan River. And the forest swallowed up the men, such that 20,000 men died. For the battle, verse 8, was spread over the whole countryside. And it says, and the forest devoured the people that day, more than the sword devoured them. So God was intervening on behalf of David. Okay?
Okay.
It says, verse 9, that Avshalom happened to meet the servants of David. What, is he greeting them? He's in the middle of the battle, and we see, verse 10, behold, Joab saw, certain man saw, his head caught, verse 9, fast in the oak. Why? Because he was very proud of his hair. We read about it. He was a handsome dude. He shaved his head only once a year, and his hair was long, weighed a lot by the time he shaved it. And that was part of his vanity, but it was his hair that caught him in the tree. So he's hanging between heaven and earth. And the men of David saw this, and they reported it back to Joab. And Joab says, why didn't you kill him? Why? Because David, in front of everybody, had said to you, be gentle on the young man, Absolom. Joab, on the other hand, says, what do I have to do with you? And he goes back and he thrusts him through with 3 spears. And then the men join him. When Joab had asked in the killing of Absolom, when Joab had asked the man, why didn't you kill him? He says, verse 12, even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver from in my hand, I would not put my hand against the king's son, for in our hearing the king charged you, Abishai and Ittai, saying, protect me from the young man Absolom. Protect for me the young man Absolom. Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Saying, I couldn't trust you to defend me before the king. So we have a picture of Joab. He's actually quite a good commander. But by the same token, he's ruthless, and his men can only trust him so far. In verse 14, we see he says, I'm not going to waste any time with you. Took 3 spears in his hand and thrust Absolom through. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absolom and killed him. Well, they're going to get back to David. They got to get the news back to David. Joab blew the trumpet. Verse 16. Vayitka Yoav bashofar. Yitka is to make a loud sound. Yoav on shofar. It's translated trumpet, but it was the ram's horn. And returned from pursuing Israel. And they took Absolom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest and erected over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, each to his tent. So they dispersed. The battle was all over. And then we read about, it says verse 18, Absolom in his lifetime had taken a set up for himself a pillar, which is in the King's Valley. Apparently, and I looked for pictures of it, and yes, there seems to be, actually it's Hezekiah's tomb, which is located in the valley between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, the valley of Hinnom. In this case, probably the King's Valley, and it's hewed out of stone. And it is near Hezekiah's tomb, and it's quite noticeable. It's quite a structure. And he built a pillar for himself because it says, I have no son to preserve my name. Now we know that he had 3 sons and a daughter, whose name was Tamar. He named her after his sister, Tamar, who had been raped by Amnon. And what happened to his 3 sons? Well, perhaps he had erected this monument to himself before his three sons had been born, or perhaps his three sons had died. Those are the only possibilities. But we get from this that Absolom was quite vain. So, verse 19, we see that, here. Verse 22, Achimaaz, the son of Zadok, said it once more to Joab, let me go run after to tell David the news. So, but Joab says, no, let this Cushite, who we don't know his name, he was probably Ethiopian, or what we call Ethiopia today, run and tell David the news. But Achimaaz knew the path of the way to Jerusalem better. And although the Cushite had a head start, he beat the Cushite to David. Verse 24, now David was sitting between two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running by himself. The watchman called and told the king, and the king said, if he is by himself, there is good news in his mouth. So the question is it good news or is it bad news? He came nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called the gatekeeper and said, behold, another man running by himself. And the king said, this one is bringing good news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first one is like the running of Achimaaz, the son of Zadok. The king said, this is a good man who comes with good news. So Achimaaz is bringing good news, but the Cushite is bringing bad news. Achimaaz called and said to the king, all is well. He prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hand against my lord the king. And where is the king's interest? Is it well with the young man Absolom? And Achimaaz answered, and Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, and I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was. So Achimaaz is vague. He's intentionally vague. Then the king said, turn aside and stand here. So he turned aside, stood still. Behold, the Cushite arrived. And the Cushite said, let my lord the king receive good news. For the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you. Then the king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absolom? The Cushite answered, let all the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as young men. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And thus he walked, O my son Absolom, my son Absolom, would I have died instead of you, O Absolom, my son, my son. Very sad words. Those words have actually been put to music. Then it was told Joab, verse 9, chapter 19, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absolom. The victory that day was turned to mourning, for all the people heard it, said that day, the king is grieved for his son. Now, Joab is going to rebuke David. Hey, David, do you care more about the people or about your son? David has a very hard task ahead of him. He's got to stop grieving over his son and mourn and stop mourning and be a leader. When I looked at this, I was thinking of President Trump. He'd lost his brother just recently. And apparently he loved his brother very much. And yet he was constantly being bombarded by his detractors. And I ain't saying that President Trump is any King David, but he knew what he had to do. He had to stop mourning and be leader of the free world. And he did that. So it's an interesting passage here. If you've got to lead, you've got to give up your own personal interests and start thinking about the people whom you're leading. Verse 4, King covered his face and cried out aloud, "Oh, Absolom, my son, my son. Absolom, my son, my son." And Joab said to him, "Today you have covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, by loving those who hate you and by hating those who love you. For you have shown today that princes and servants are nothing to you. For I know that this day that Absolom were alive and you and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased." What a rebuke. And you'd think that Absolom, that Joab would fear for his life giving that kind of a message to the king. But it was the right thing to do. Joab had been given the command to spare the life of Absolom. He knew, though, that it was not the right thing to do. So he has Absolom put to death. If Absolom had lived, David and his kingdom would not have survived. And he knew what the important thing was, the sparing of the kingdom. So, yeah, Absolom, Joab is ruthless. And we're going to discover later that he's ruthless. We saw that he had killed Avner earlier, who ran a rebellion against David. We're going to see that he's going to kill Amasa in cold blood. And so he's ruthless. And yet, in some ways, he's right. So, verse 8, the king arose and sat in the gate. When they told all the people, saying, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate," then all the people came before the king. Now he's in the process of re-establishing his kingdom. And Israel fled, each to his tent. All the people were quarreling throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies." Now, who are those enemies? The Philistines. Verse 9. But now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. However, Absolom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now then, why are you silent about bringing the king back? So it's really up to the people to bring David back. Then King David said to Zadok and Abiathar the priest, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house? Since the word of all Israel has come to the king, even to his house." So in other words, Israel, they're thinking, well, should we bring the king back? Should we not? And how can we bring the king back if Judah, if Yehuda, the tribe, isn't going to bring the king back? And they haven't accepted them yet either. So he gives a message to the priests, and he says to them, "You are my brothers. You are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? Say to Amasa," Amasa was the head of Avshalom's army. Amasa was his nephew through his sister-in-law, Abigail. David's sister-in-law, Abigail. The sister of Truya, David's stepmother. Is that clear?
Repeat that again. David's stepmother.
Truya was the wife, one of the wives of Ishai or Ishi, David's father, or Jesse. He was one of the wives of Ishi, David's father. I don't think we even know who David's mother is. We know who his father is. And Truya was one of David. No, it was his sister. And so was Abigail, or Abigail. He had a wife named Abigail and a sister named Abigail. And Abigail had Amasa, which made Amasa David's nephew. Okay, you clear now?
I'm clear. I'm just very confused about this whole thing with all these people having more than one wife. I have trouble with life. How many women can live in a home like that and coexist?
You're absolutely right. And they are in defiance. You know, I was really kind of struggling with that because it said David had said, or God had said to David through Nathan, "You have defied the Lord, and from now on, all this is going to happen to your house." And I think it was through the adultery of David, taking the wife of another man. But we see that that God had always intended one man, one woman. And that was part of God's plan.
How did
I think that...
How did they get off track with all these women and concubines? What is this? That you just bring more women into the house? I can't picture how this could come about. I mean, you marry your wife, supposed to be until death do us part, and all that stuff. And meanwhile, you bring them into the house.
That wasn't really the case. I think that's part of American culture. Back then, their culture was, I'll take a bunch of wives, but I'm not going to commit adultery. And yet, by the same token, God's command had always been one man, one woman. And so, even back then, David had shown disregard for the command of God. What did this what did this happen? Today, we say, "Oh, I'm not happy with my wife. I think I'll divorce her." God had always said, "One man, one woman." And if you're going to mess around with a woman, okay, marry her. And so back then, what did they do? They took several wives. Today, what do? We marry and divorce.
Isn't that adultery as well? I mean, aside from stealing Uriah's wife, that was adultery.
Well, Jesus defined it. He more accurately defined it for us, which is, if you lust after a woman, you've committed adultery.
Right. Okay, so I got that. But, aside from Bathsheba, if he happened to see some pretty girl walking down the street, hey, you want to marry me? Come back and what about his other wife? You still committing adultery against his other wife.
Against his other wives. Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. I don't get it.
But culturally, yeah, I mean, the culture trumped the law of God. And that's what happens.
Was God upset with this, that they were doing this?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure he was. He permitted it. Even as Jesus said to I think it was the Pharisees, he said, Moses permitted, that you could divorce. But from the beginning, it has always been one man, one woman. It was for the hardness of your heart. Jesus said that.
And we can see this today. These people, David had trouble with his family because he had a bunch of wives. You see the people that marry, get a divorce. What they have? They got trouble in their family. Same thing.
Hey, I have trouble with my family, and I have the same wife. What can I say?
Mark, I can't picture more than one. Can you imagine that?
Okay, let's move on. We're never going to finish the Bible.
It's a never-ending pursuit anyway. Come on.
Huh?
The never-ending pursuit anyway.
It's an amazing book. People say, I've repeated this and repeated this. People say, I've read the Bible. Well, the truth of the matter is, you've never read the Bible. You have to keep reading and reading and reading and reading.
Amen.
Okay, where are we? So David he's trying to draw the tribe of Judah back to himself, because if Judah doesn't come back to him, the rest of Israel won't come back to him. And we see that the tribes of Israel are talking among themselves. It's almost like the Pharisees talking among themselves, saying, is this the Messiah? Is the Messiah supposed to do more? We see this in terms of their interaction concerning David. And so he's trying to convince, the tribes. So he's trying to convince Judah to come back. And so we're seeing the seeds of a divided kingdom right here. Say to Amasa, he says, verse 13. Amasa, as we recall, was his nephew, He was also the leader of Avshalom's army. He says, say to him, are you not my bone and my flesh? May God do so to me and more also if you will not be commander of the army before me continually in place of Joab. So in other words, yeah, Joab has given David some pretty good advice, but he's also ruthless. David has cursed Joab because of what you did to Avner, which, by the way, had taken place in Hebron, which happens to be a city of refuge. May there not cease to be a woman, a man among you doing a woman's chores, manning the distaff. And may all of your children die a premature death. So he curses Joab. And then he says, Amasa is going to take Joab's place. Well, this is a political move on David's part. He's trying to win back the people of Judah, his own people. And so we see, thus he turned the hearts of all the men of Judah as one man. So they sent word to the king saying, return, you and all your servants. So the king then returned and came as far as the Jordan, and Yehuda came, or the tribe of Judah came to Gilgal, which is on the east side of the Jordan, in order to go to meet the king, to bring the king across the Jordan. So now we see the battle is won. Judah comes to bring the king back. But we see there are signs of rebellion. Shimei, verse 16. See how his name is actually pronounced. I can't find it here. Shimei, the son of Gera, from Benjamin. Maybe it's in a different verse. Hurried and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. There were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him. He's got a sizable platoon. Okay, and he came to meet David. Okay, you're the king. And along with him came Ziba, the servant of the house of Shaul, of Saul, and his 15 sons and 20 servants with them. And they rushed to the Jordan before the king, and they kept crossing the ford to bring over the king's house and to do, can you see me adequately? I had to turn this light off a little bit. There we go. They rushed to the Jordan before the king. Then they kept crossing the ford to bring over the king's household and to do what was good in the sight of the king. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan. So he said to the king, let not my lord consider me guilty, nor remember me what your servant did wrong on the side when the king came out from Jerusalem. So the king would take it to heart. For your servant knows that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I have come today, the first of all the household of Joseph to go down to meet my son, my Lord the King. So Shimei had cursed the king. He's throwing stones at the king. He's throwing stones at all the men as they cross over the Jordan. And now he comes and he falls down before the king and he asks, "Forgive me." But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said, "Should not Shimei be put to death for this because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" Verse 22, then David said, "What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be an adversary to me?" This reminds me of I thought I discussed this, but I guess I hadn't. I discussed it in my own mind. That this is reminiscent of Peter saying, "No, you're not going to the cross." Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." So he's always got these men who are trying to learn from him, and yet they carry messages from Satan as well. Here's the same thing. We see Shimei, a messenger of Satan, and or not Shimei, but Abishai, his nephew, a messenger of Satan, a loyal servant, a loyal general, but saying the wrong things. And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And thus the king swore to him. Well, who's there else to meet him on his way back? Mephibosheth, verse 24. He came down to meet the king and said, and he had neither cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes, from the day the king departed until the day he came home in peace. Mephibosheth he comes before the king. It was when he came from Jerusalem to meet the king that the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" So he answered, "Oh, my lord, the king, my servant deceived me." And who's a servant? Ziba, who had told David that Mephibosheth, hey, he's going to stay with Absolom. So he answered, "Oh, my lord, the king, my servant deceived me, for your servant said, I will saddle a donkey for myself that I may ride on it and go with the king, because your servant is lame. Moreover, he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God, therefore do what is good in your sight. For all my father's household was nothing but dead men before your lord the king. My lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who ate at your table. What right do I have yet that I should complain any more to the king?" So the king said to him, why do you still speak of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land. So the king says, "Okay, I had promised Ziba everything that you had, but hey, now I know the truth. He's not going to take everything away from Ziba, but he's going to give half of it back to Mephibosheth." And Mephibosheth said, verse 30, "Let him even take it all, since my lord the king has come safely to his own house." The only thing that matters to Mephibosheth is that David has returned. That's the only thing that matters. How about us? Is the only thing that matters that Jesus is alive? We're going on faith. And I'm thinking, we may see chaos in this country. And I look at the prophet Haggai, who said, okay, the enemy is coming. They're going to turn the land into spoil. Even though the harvest no longer survives, and we experience famine, yet I will put my trust in the Lord. Hey, crazy people are going through neighborhoods. We've seen that in St. Louis. And no matter how this election goes, I'm not anticipating the very best of things. And yes, I have a bias. Yes, I know who I want to be president. But even so, no matter what happens, the Lord is king. Mephibosheth was happy that David was back. And he was willing to give up everything, simply knowing that he could eat at the table of David. Now Barzillai, the Gileadite, had come down, and he gives a whole bunch of stuff, and we don't know much about Barzillai except he was relatively wealthy. He lived in Rogelim. Rogelim means the fullers, the Valley of the Fuller. That's where they bleached their clothes. So apparently he was a well-to-do man. He was a businessman, and he provided a lot of material for David for his trek back to Jerusalem. And David says, why don't you come with me back to Jerusalem? Barzillai says, why should I go? I'm 80 years old. I can't distinguish from good and bad, or even taste what you feed me. I'll be just a burden to you. I'll cross over the Jordan with you, but I'll send my friend Chimha back with you. Let him cross over with you, and he will do what is good in your sight. And the king answered, Chimham will cross over with me, verse 38, and I will do for him what is good in your sight, and whatever you require of me, I will do for you. David is the king, but he's a servant. And so all the people crossed over the Jordan, and the king crossed too, and the king then kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and Barzillai returned to his place. King went on to Gilgal, verse 40. And where was Gilgal? We recall that Gilgal was the launching pad for Joshua, way back earlier, on the east and the west side of the Jordan. It was the place where Joshua began his conquest. So we see that he is at Gilgal. Verse 41, and behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, why had our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household and all David's men with him over the Jordan? So we see jealousy arising. Israel against Judah. Judah against Israel. It's underlying. The king is going to reunite the kingdom, and his son Solomon is going to reunite the kingdom even further. And as long as the kingdom is successful, the kingdom will be united. But it's going to be Israel against Judah. Then all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is a close relative to us. Why then are you angry about this matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has anything been taken for us? But the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king. Therefore, we also have more claim on the king than you. Why then did you treat us with contempt? Was it not our advice first before to bring back our king? Yet the words of the men of Judah were harsher than the words of the men of Israel. So we see a war going on. There's going to be a division in the kingdom. I find this kind of interesting. The church has claimed Jesus. And the Jews haven't even done that. And yet Jesus is more a part of the Jews. I don't understand it. Does that rise up some level of curiosity? Chapter 20. Now, a worthless fellow happened to be there whose name was Sheva, son of Bichri, a Benjamite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. So he is about to raise a revolt. And it's a serious revolt. We're on the verge of having a civil war. Verse 2, so all the men of Israel withdrew from following David and followed Sheva, the son of Bichri, even though David had managed to muster the people of Judah behind him. But the men of Judah remained steadfast to the king, from the Jordan even to Jerusalem. Then David came to his house at Jerusalem, and the king took the 10 women, the concubines whom he had left to keep the house, and placed them under guard, and provided them with sustenance, but did not go into them. So they were shut up until the day of their death, living as widows. That addresses part of the problem that you had brought up, Tom. What a horrible life. They couldn't marry. They were just left there. Verse 4, then the king said to Amasa, call out the men of Judah for me within 3 days and be present here yourself. So Amasa went to call out the men of Judah, but he delayed longer than he had set time which he had appointed him. So Amasa is not a very good general. David had fulfilled his promise. He's going to make him general. He's not doing his job. And it was utmost importance that they muster the troops and quell this revolt that's being carried out by Shimei. So David said to Abishai, now Shiva, the son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absolom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him so that he does not find for himself fortified cities and escape from our sight. So Joab's men went out after him, Joab being Avishai's brother. And he had been demoted. Nevertheless, Amasa is ineffective. And so the command goes to Avishai. So Joab's men went out after him, along with the Kerethites and the Pelethites and the mighty men. And those, as we recall, were foreigners who had become literally part of David's bodyguard. So they're going all in pursuit after Shimei. And went out from Jerusalem to pursue, not Shimei, but Sheva, the son of Bichri. When they were at the large stone which is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Amasa wants to still be in the battle. He's not doing well as a leader, but he wants to join in the battle. When they were at the large stone, Amasa came out to meet them. Now Joab was dressed in his military attire, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath, fastened at his waist. And as he went forward, it fell out. Joab said to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. Verse 10, but Amasa was not on guard against the sword which was in Joab's hand. So he struck him in the belly, and his guts poured out. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheva, the son of Bichri. Now there stood by him one of Joab's young men and said, "Whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab." But Amasa lay wallowing in his blood in the middle of the highway. And when the men saw that all the people stood still, he removed Amasa from the highway into the field and threw a garment over him when he saw that everyone who came by him stood still. Well, they came to a town in Summary, which is located literally north of Dan, way up past Galilee. And they started a siege against that town. And a woman called out and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Are you Joab?" And Joab says, "Yes, it is I." And he says, "What do you want?" He says, "We're here to get Sheva, the son of Bichri." So she says, "Wait, I'll throw his head out over the side of the wall, and that way you'll put an end to it all." So they do just that, and the battle is won, and David has consolidated Israel. All this is taking place without any mention in the book of Chronicles. And so I want to end with one other incident before we pick up the book of Chronicles again. And it's in chapter 21. There's no rain for 3 years. David has consolidated Israel. And when there's no rain in the land, it's an indication of something wrong spiritually, idolatry. And you'd think that David would have inquired for 2 years, but he doesn't inquire until the 3rd year. And this alludes to what I had said earlier, that what we do impacts our children. A very sad story. David sought the presence of the Lord. Here in all of this, we're finally getting David seeking wisdom from God himself. And the Lord said, "It is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." We don't have any mention of this event anywhere throughout the life of Saul, but apparently this happened while Saul was the king. Now, as we recall, the Gibeonites had sought refuge under Joshua. They had tricked Joshua, but nevertheless, Israel had signed a contract with Joshua, with the Gibeonites. "We're going to protect you. You are under our charge. You will be our servants, but we will protect you." And Saul had broken this agreement. And we see it is because he put the Gibeonites to death. And because of that, God is not blessing the land. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. I want to bring one other point. We know that David is the king, but ultimately he gave, Sheva had revolted, but nevertheless, David gave the people the freedom to receive him as a king. He never, David had, Sheva had amassed an army against the king, but it was Sheva who was the leader of the revolt. It was he who had to be put to death. Then David gave the freedom to everyone to join the kingdom. He's not lording it over them. And that's very much the way Jesus is with us. He gives us the freedom. Are you gonna follow me or not? So let's move on. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, as we recall, but of the remnant of the Amorites. They'd been in the land before Joshua. And the sons of Israel made a covenant with them, but Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. Thus David said to the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you?" Again, we see David acting as a servant. He's being a servant to his servants. Thus, what shall I do for you? And how can I make atonement that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? I want you to bless Israel, but you need an atonement. You need a kapora. And the Gibeonites said to him, "We have no concern of silver or gold with Saul or his house, nor is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "I will do for you whatsoever you say." So they said to the king, the man who consumed us and who planned to exterminate us from remaining within any border of Israel, let 7 men from his sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord in Gibeon of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king said, I will give them. Now, to be honest, I don't see too much mercy on the side of the Gibeonites. They are not very gracious. Nevertheless, this is the consequence of sin. It does affect our posterity. So David gives them the sons of Saul, but he spares Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, because of the law of an oath he had given to Jonathan. So the king took the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and so on, and 5 other sons of Saul, and gave them to the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them in the mountain before the Lord, so that the 7 of them fell together, and they were put to death in the first days of the harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. That would be, I believe, around the time of Shavuos or Pentecost. It was like an offering to the Lord. And Rizpah, who was the mother of 2 of these young men, took out sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of the harvest until it rained on them from the sky. And she allowed neither the birds of the sky to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. When it was told to David what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done, and David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the many men of Yabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the open square of Beit Sha'an. Do we recall that they had taken those bones from the Philistines who had taken them, where the Philistines had hanged them on the day the Philistines struck down Saul in Gilboa. He brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there, and they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin, in Zelah, in the grave of Kish his father. And they did all the king commanded. And after that, God was moved by prayer for the land. Now, so we're going to stop here. And we see that it was literally because of the hanging of these 7 sons of Saul that it began to rain. That the famine had stopped. And it was because atonement had to be made because of the sin of Saul. Any questions? Any add-ons? Any thoughts?
No.
No.
Sad, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need to pray desperately for our country. In reality, I guess the sons of our forefathers, in spite of the fact that their sins had been accepted slavery, that they had atoned for it in the Civil War, yet we're still atoning for it today. Our country is really, really, really in need of atonement and prayer.